So, good evening, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to join us on a Saturday evening. On behalf of ISPP, I'd like to welcome you all for today's webinar on how data analysis shapes policy leaders. Let me start by introducing myself. My name is Alaksha. I am the scholar from this current batch of PDM program here at ISPP. I'll be your host for this webinar. Moderating today's discussion is Nandita Banerjee. Nandita is a faculty member in ISPP's Lokniti program, where she teaches the course of data analysis and management. She's also the head of HR and capacity building at ASER Center and brings over 2 decades of experience in non-profit sector. She has worked in renowned organizations such as HelpAge India, Dignity Foundation, and the National University of Singapore in roles that span non-profit management, capacity building, research, monitoring, and advocacy. She currently focuses on strengthening knowledge, employee knowledge, and skills through training. We are thrilled to have you here today, Nandita. Before we dive into this thought-provoking session, I'd like to introduce our incredible panel. Our first panelist is Arushi Malhotra, currently a senior designer at Dalberg Design, where she brings together design thinking and behavioral science to her work, creating innovative, inclusive, and scalable solutions. She began her career in monitoring and evaluation, strengthening evidence-based decision-making at UNESCO, and was part of the founding team of the Development, Monitoring, and Evaluation Office, India's Apex M&E office. She has also led the establishment of India's Behavioral Insight Unit with Niti Aayog. It's a pleasure to have you with us, Arushi. Next, we have Priyank Khare, an urban planner and architect with over a decade of experience in implementing public policies, strategizing, and designing online platforms. Priyank currently leads state projects in Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh at the All India Institute of Local Self-Governance, contributing to key initiatives such as GIS-based property tax surveys and the socio-economic profiling of street vendors in Madhya Pradesh. He has also worked with the National Institute of Urban Affairs here in Delhi. Priyank is also an ISPP alumni from our Lokniti program, September 2023. Glad to have you with us, Priyank. Finally, we have Samyak Sharma, a senior executive with MSL India's Public Affairs and Social Impact team in New Delhi. Samyak brings a diverse experience, having worked with Center for Policy Research and Global Trade Observer in Delhi, where she focused on communication and policy. She has also teamed with esteemed organizations like Carnage India, JPAL, and Teach for India. Samyak is also an alumni of our PDM program, class of 2022. Welcome, Samyak. Without further ado, let's start our discussion. Over to you, Nandita.
Thank you and welcome everyone. I hope you will find this webinar as fulfilling and learning as we have in putting it together for you. I would like to set the context and just begin this webinar with what Pratham Education Foundation and ASER Center does, and how is it related to policy formulation. Pratham Education Foundation is very well known. It's a very old organization working towards children's learning outcomes. And at some point, and decades ago that is, we realized that it's very important to generate data for social work as well. Because while there is a lot of knowledge as to what is lacking and what should be done about services that are absent or out of reach for marginalized people especially, but until and unless it is not quantified in some form of data, it's not easy to communicate, it is not easy to disseminate and implement any program. So with that, the ASER survey was started, which is called the Annual Status of Education Report. And what ASER did was that while it wasn't like that the government or the civil society organizations were not working towards education or improvement of it, but what ASER did was it brought into the forefront that it is just not enough to enroll children in schools. And while universalization of education aimed at that, and it's a commendable job that has been done by the government, but also the focus has to be on learning outcomes. So the interesting bit is that the narrative changed from enrollment to learning outcomes. So, and it over a couple of decades of work, it has influenced policy. And if you see the new education policy, it mentions about learning outcomes, and it mentions about foundational literacy and numeracy for children, especially primary school going children. So, with that context, with that foundation, I'd like to invite, I think I'll start with Arushi. How, because I'm from a civil society organization and you're from Dalworks, it would be nice because otherwise it just conversation goes from, one civil society to another. It will be refreshing to see how you look at data. I also want you to talk a little bit about the reliability and accuracy of the data that you generally, refer to. How does Dalberg look into it? You are an M&E specialist. I think it will be very interesting to know your views. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nandita, and thank you everyone for having me here. I'm glad to be here and talk about something that has been a key part of my life from almost 10 years now, that is data and evidence-based decision making of any sort. So, Nandita, I'll maybe start off with answering how does Dalberg use data. I'll look at specifically my work. In my work of design, a lot of the data we use is actually primarily qualitative data. In fact, we have a very sort of mixed methods approach where, of course, there is a little bit of reliance on secondary data to understand context of any sort of problem statement that we're dealing with. So, for example, if I have to design a learning experience for micro entrepreneurs so that they're able to improve their business skills, I'd want to understand what are the gaps, right? What are also the learning needs. Every person would have a different learning need, right? No matter your sector, your gender, where you live, what kind of business you run. And so we recognize that it's for us, it's more important instead of quantity, we focus a lot on quality of data and make sure that we're trying to um, cover as many types of people and their needs as possible, just so that the final product or service or experience that we design is inclusive and not exclusive, right? Like we're aware that bad data or bad quality evidence will eventually lead to a poorly designed experience, right? And I'm sure that ASER has like tons of examples of how just poor decision making, poor quality of evidence leads to just bad choices. And that's not anybody's fault per se, but a lot of times it's just helpful to broaden and look at different types of people. So at Dalberg Design, what we specifically look at is um, how much and what level of nuanced data are we able to collect. And we oftentimes like to work with communities to be able to get a more granular understanding, because as researchers, we come from outside, right? Like we have our own context, we have our own biases that we may not be aware of, and it's really also important that as researchers we're kind of aware that we bring our own point of view whenever we're collecting and analyzing data. So for example, if I'm designing a learning experience, am I intentionally or unconsciously just focusing on one type of solution that I think is easier to implement, right? Or am I taking into account that perhaps women may have a different learning need in a cultural setting versus men in that same village or that same locality? So oftentimes we focus a lot on identifying and bringing out the nuance in a specific sort of problem statement, and that's why a lot of our qualitative work will be with community. And as often as we can try, we try and work with community researchers so they can include their own sort of understanding as well of a cultural context. And I'll give an example. This is not from my work at Dalberg, but this is from a previous sort of engagement where we had designed, or rather, the organization had designed an intervention, and there was an impact, when there was an impact assessment done. But however, at the time of designing the intervention, I think what was missed out is an understanding of the context in which the intervention would be implemented. So the final product that was designed was actually too costly to be implemented by anybody. And so while there was an impact, because we didn't take into account the full context in which it will be implemented, the final product was actually not really helpful, right? Like there was an impact, but it was prohibitively expensive for anybody to use it. Similarly, I think if anybody has maybe had an opportunity to read Invisible Women, I think it really highlights how the lack of gender inclusive data or disaggregated data has led to such bad design of products and services that are not suited to women at all. And this is just women, right? We haven't even gone into the intersectionalities of what happens when you don't collect accurate data. And one thing that I really appreciate about the ASER learning outcome survey is that it's a great creative, it's a great example of creative problem solving, right? A conventional approach would be to just look at maybe what children are scoring at exams, or what focus was on learning outcomes. And the way the questions are asked, when you look at specifically at a specific age, what is the level of or application of knowledge a child should have, and you're able to capture it. I think that's such a great example of creative problem solving and just using some innovative ways of collecting data. But I'm going to stop here and happy to answer any follow-ups.
No, I think it's. I think. Thank you so much, Arushi. And I'm just picking on some of the points that you made. And I'd like Priyank next to answer this. Is that what you talked about disaggregated data? I think that's very important. Just not having earlier. Yes, there was a want of data, so we didn't have any good data. Now that there is data that is available, but the lack of disaggregated data makes taking decisions or even design, there are flaws in the design because of that. So Priyank, you've been working with the government, and I mean, very interestingly, I heard that you're also working with street vendors. How do you see it from when you are working? Because what I also know, without really pointing fingers, that disaggregated data is very difficult to get, and people are to keep their data so close to their heart, whereas it is supposed to be for social good. Do you have any comments, any insights into this? How do you manage or navigate around that?
Yeah, so thanks, Nandita. I think it's a very relevant question, and we need to understand that when we are like my role is more of an implementer, where we work directly with the communities, sort of deliver the government policies to the end users. And I think a lot goes through with the basic outreach as well. The data at the initial stage helps. For example, in Swanidhi, the street vendors, Atmanirbhar Nidhi, we do have a basic data that, but then there is a further data about the socioeconomic profile that we need to create. And the problem with street vendors, it's a very migratory population. They don't really stay in one city. So to get hold of the street vendors at the right time is one of the key challenges. So especially also with other projects that we are working with NPU, we see so in both the cases, outreach was something that really helped us, and making people aware of the objectives of the program. And what helped, what we sort of used to do was that we used to break the objectives down to smaller steps or pieces that started making sense to the end users. And the same broken down information was also taken in the data analysis that we used to. So that used to help us in categorization as well. This data, when was taken forward to the government, it really helped them in deciding how to approach the particular. Let's say we worked at ward levels as well in some of the cities. So each ward has its own demography, its own challenges, its own complaints. So how we gave the information out and how we collected it was something that was very key in the kind of work that we were doing. What the challenge that we used to face in terms of, also coming back to the question that you asked about the data quality, is a lot of this data is being fed manually. So when it comes to verifying this data, validating this data, it becomes a really big challenge. For example, the property tax survey that we are doing, I mean, there are, let's say, 140,000 houses in one of the towns, and to check each of the towns, it's impossible for any of the, let's say, municipal corporation. What we also miss out is on our unified data repository. So there are different platforms to manage information. So there is e-Nagar Palika, but then there is another to capture the data, but there is another, let's say for Swanidhi, you have one to create the profile, but then there's another to create the linkages with the schemes that the Swanidhi is trying to provide. If that could have been automated, and if they could have been a clear governance structure that reduces the amount of effort that we have to put in, is one of the things that we usually face as well. But then it comes I mean, there is a lot of human dependency still in these things, but then I think that's also a good thing that we're not really heavily relying entirely on algorithm and platforms. Um, I do have more points, but maybe I can speak if time permits, but we can also take it forward. Yeah.
I will come back to you. I have a very important question to ask, but I like Samyak to have her views, having heard from Arushi and Priyank and knowing about what we're talking about here. How does MSL Group and the work that you do, how does it, how do you look at data challenges, and how dependent are you on good, accurate data on I mean, what on whatever, whether regular, or how do you go about it? Yeah.
Not saying this from a MSL perspective, saying it in general from over the past few years that I've worked with different organizations.
Sure.
So, I believe that obviously data plays an indispensable role when it comes to policy making. And I'll just give you a very minor example because I've already always worked in policy comms. My main task has been to communicate the data that has already been established to the external audience to amplify, let's say, a particular issue that we are talking about. And when I go online or when I go to different resources provided by the government or any other organization, I have realized it's not for a particular sector, but for every sector. I believe the amount of data that is available to the public is very limited. And then the second point comes to the credibility, as Arushi was also speaking about. Because whenever I visit, let's say, XYZ website, I'm always doubtful if I can rely on a data. But when I come to a government website, I can obviously close my eyes and say, okay, I can rely on this data and I can quote it to the external audience and I won't be questioned for it. But that reliability is close to zero right now, I would say, because I come across very limited resources where I can say, yeah, that data is trustable and I need not think twice about it. And also, when it comes to the importance of data in general and disaggregated data, like we were just talking about, uh, I believe that disaggregated data in terms of subsections, India is quite a vast country with a huge amount of population, and different data for different subsections of the society is critical, in my opinion, to be honest. Because let's just give quoting an example of the recent caste census debate that is going on. If you take that into account, you would realize. I think last to last week, I was discussing it with someone that we were just discussing our opinions on it, and my idea was that if I don't know of a particular section, how much are they in population, what's their or like what do they do on a daily basis, like any data, I don't have any data related to them. So how can I say that this policy that I've made for them would be fruitful for them? Like, I don't think I can comment on anything without a backed up statistic that I have. And I think the recent caste census debate going on is the most accurate example for whatever we are talking about right now. And there are a lot of mixed opinion for it, but yeah, I think that those are my 2 cents on it for now.
No, quite useful and insightful, and I agree. And I wanted to ask Priyank, while we move on to another, but before that, so having done the kind of work you do with collecting data and presenting it, and since it's not as it's not automated, so there are different systems at the same time going on simultaneously, so information exchange is not streamlined. How does it affect implementation of schemes and policies?
Uh, I think we, for one of the projects that we did, we had to ensure a lot of processes, and we had to streamline a lot of processes where we ensure that the data that we are getting is correctly processed and is, let's say, as precise as it could be. Um, since we didn't have any other way to verify it, I mean, that's where a lot of human interference was required. But then uh, we had to process a lot of or streamline a lot of processes that made sure that these steps are taken. We had to create report structures. We had to create fields that made sure that there is information that is coming in a way that is, and we at the same time we used to keep it so open ended so that people would not really get the data which information is being used for what kind of analysis. That I think is also because a lot of in a way systems mapping or systemic thinking is something that is also not being utilized when we speak of creating these kind of platforms. Uh, so yeah, I mean, these were some things that or initiatives that we had to take from our end, but then it also required a lot of convincing, working directly with the government officials and trying to tell them why this is required. And they also, I mean, there was a lot of conversation that kept happening. So there were points that we had to add as per the needs as well. But then slowly, when we started speaking a common language where both of us could speak similar terms, is when things sort of got a little easier, and that's how we started uh, getting at least some clarity and some fruitful results. And yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think finding that common place is very, very important. It's an important step in leading to that. Arushi, how do you deal with, when there is, like Samyak said and Priyank said, there are, of course, issues, technological issues like streamlining of data, also data collection methods. How do you look at it when you are analyzing secondary data? I know primary is still under control, the same, that is one of the reasons ASER also does it on its own. But how do you, because it does the secondary, like you very well said, the secondary data is required, you need it to contextualize, feed in, and you can not get everything yourself all the time, right? So how does Dalberg and how do you, your team, come do get across this obstacle?
It's I don't think we found a perfect answer for that, honestly. I think every project, every problem statement that you get, you will find, for example, what I mean is that in some sectors, maybe there's more data than there is in others. For example, I do think that labor in general suffers a lot from like deficit of good quality data, not just on in terms of like who is employed, but in terms of the quality of their employment, who's doing what type of work, what is the productivity. I think it's a constant challenge. And one thing that I think even Priyank talked about is that oftentimes that sort of systems lens that we should need or should have at a problem is often missing. It is slightly time consuming to just take zoom out and take a look at all the actors. But I think number one, that is a very helpful approach. When you take a zoomed out lens at a problem, at least you're able to identify the interconnected nature of the problem statement. Like if you look at even public health, there are so many factors that affect your access to a primary health center. It's not just the fact that it exists or it doesn't exist. Do you trust it? Can you walk to it? If there is walking, can you take your day off? Right. So if you're able to zoom out, at least you're able to identify these interdependencies and learn about those to create somewhat a photo of what the problem statement is. That's why I do think that it's very hard to kind of not rely on primary data collection. It is something every organization should invest in, right? You need both. It's impossible to just be focused on one, but I think it's also important to have that system view lens. Second, and this is a little bit less from Dalberg, but more of my experience at Niti when we were doing the M&E work is work really collaboratively with the program officers and ministries to identify proxy data points. Sometimes data, especially when you were trying to capture a lot of behavioral metrics in health, a lot of Ministry of Health programs are targeting different types of health behaviors, right? Pregnant women seeking ANC services, parents getting the children vaccinated. These are all essentially behaviors. And so, what are the different proxy indicators that we can identify while in parallel continue to develop those data collection mechanisms that are crucially needed? And also at the same time, making sure that they are disaggregated. I think also, I think the third point is sifting through the mountains of data. While there are sectors that don't have enough data, there are sectors that have just way too much data, because I think we've gone on this whole thing that let's collect everything. But what is the quality of data, right? I think it's always important to question and look at, try and identify the biases of who has collected as secondary data. You don't want to fall into a confirmation bias, right? Like you are just seeking data that is consistently validating your thought process. You need to look for things that are not validating your thought process. So I think just having some critical thinking skills on hand is really helpful when you're sifting through secondary data, because it again will not tell you the complete picture, and you need to kind of keep questioning it, look for different sources, look for more disaggregated sources, and look for proxies, and give yourself a little bit of creative freedom to look at other sort of, look beyond sometimes purely academic texts. Look at, I do feel like there's so much data that comes out from a lot of NGOs, a lot of smaller organizations that do work, and that sometimes can get missed out because we've in our mind that there is certain types of evidence that is more high quality. So I think a little bit of critical thinking is important at this point.
Um,
Thank you so much. Having heard both of them, Samyak, would you like to share, like, then how do you, so since, because I would like to move from what there is not available, what is lacking, and how we, uh, we do primary data collection, but otherwise for normal people like who are interested in public policy and data, the question is always that, okay, what do we do with the existing system, in the existing system, to understand and do something about it? Because systems change will take time, as Priyank said that it has taken, Arushi is mentioning. So Samyak, how do you then get your data and information from?
So, as I earlier mentioned, so in policy comms, we do not work with a lot of data on a day-to-day basis. So, as much as it for other sectors, that might not be a very big issue for us. But whenever we need to rely on a certain data for any of the work that we are doing, it's always been a challenge, and we are not able to find a smooth pathway on how to find the best data possible. So it has always been a challenge, and nobody has been able to find the solution for it. But talking about it from a future lens, I might be wrong here, but I believe with the advent of technologies like AI, ML, the streamlining of data can be made better. So like there are a lot of debates going on, and if the AI or the ML or the new systems are good for us or bad for us. And I've always said that it's how you use it for yourself. So I think with the advent of these technologies, and these are very erupting in new technologies, and people are very interested in learning more about it. And it has streamlined plus made the work convenient. So I think with this evolving framework, uh, the questions of which data is reliable, plus gathering data, analyzing data, and each of these stages can be solved better for the public as well as for better policy implementation.
Okay, great. I'm glad you said that, because here we are, including me, we are very data driven,
Yeah.
right? And here you are saying that you're actually not regularly using a lot of data. And of course, there's lack of data that for you to. Um, so this is also, I think this is also a great learning, especially in this day and age when everything is surrounded by that. Everyone assumes that everyone is working with a lot of data around them. So has it, and follow-up question to this is, then how do you get in, do the kind of work that you do? What helps then? Where do you get your information from?
So, when it comes to policy comms, it's never data heavy, to be honest. It has always been the so just to make it easier. So, if there's a certain topic and you want to communicate it to the external audience,
Right,
policy comms is just a segue, just a path for it. So
right.
when it comes to policy comms, our work is not to make certain things data heavy. It's just to find the easiest way possible so that a layman, the external public, can understand what is being tried to communicate in the most easiest way possible. So we don't deal with a lot of data or these things on a day-to-day basis. It's just to find a better segue between a entity and the external audience.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
That's quite a new learning for me, to be very frank, and I'm glad that we spoke about it.
So
Um,
just to
yeah.
add on here, so policy comms is certainly a new field, and I believe even before joining, I after ISPP, policy comms was a new introduction for me too, and I realized that I'm interested in it. But policy comms is a very new developing sector, I would say, but an essential one, to be honest.
Of course, it's essential. And if you are, I think there's some underling for me at least that, if you can make a policy communication without using too much data,
Yeah,
that's interesting, and you are able to communicate it in a language that is easily understood. So
yeah.
that's great. So then I have another question, and I'll come back to you, Arushi and Priyank. Just be a little patient with me. So, then how do you see advocacy then? How policy advocacy? How do we do that? How would you look at it?
So that's quite an interesting question,
I'll
but
give you a minute to do, and this question is open to both Arushi and Priyank as well. Whoever wants to give it a thought and discuss it here.
yeah. So I think Arushi or Priyank should go first. I'll add on to it.
Okay.
I don't mind coming in first. This is something I've thought about a little bit as well. And one of the things that when we were working on it, even when setting up the M&E office or the BI Behavioral Insights unit, is like, how do you convince people? And for me, like my learning was using behavior science to try and understand and how do you communicate to people, because I think it's fairly common knowledge is that statistics, telling people statistics doesn't do anything. It's not even about policymakers. I think if you just look at us individually sitting on this Zoom, a lot of us know a lot of things are bad habits or things that we shouldn't do gets thrown at us or we don't follow, right? So, what is the right way to communicate? I think some of the aspects, I think, of course, are like connecting with the audience that you're speaking with, right? I think when I'm going to talk to bureaucrats, I have to also be understanding of the position they are in, right? To assume that they don't know about the sector that we are trying to talk about, I think is also like not a great place to start from, right? So understanding their context, understanding the challenges they face, because there are some incredible challenges that our bureaucracy actually is able to overcome and deliver services, right? I think we kind of sometimes tend to forget that, but understanding their context, understanding what framing would help them, right? Not shaming anybody, but rather saying that you can do this is a great way to start. And so, yeah, I think I also agree with Samyak in saying that sometimes you really don't need data as much as how you frame that data for people. How are you, like I think you said in the beginning, Nandita, like what is the story behind the data that we're trying to say? And that's the story we need to focus on and frame it in the way somebody will understand it, right? Like there's no need if somebody's not like it's like if somebody knows French and I'm talking to them in English, obviously they're not going to understand it. So how am I framing that story for them plays a huge role, and also maybe not approaching it with the assumption that there will be resistance, but I think approaching it like, yes, I will meet resistance. How do we overcome it? And being a little bit more collaborative throughout, I think is helpful, and being open to different approaches. I think in for me when I'm thinking of advocacy, I'm always thinking more about the target audience and less about the information I have to present, because that always can be managed in some way. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much for that. And also, while you were talking, I was kind of thinking about what Samyak said. And I think I can add something here. And it has never registered, but after what you both said, it is coming to me more, there's more clarity. Similarly, when we do the annual status of education report, the data that we bring is very simple data. It's about enrollment, attendance, and learning levels of children in foundational literacy and numeracy. So it's basic, and it is in averages and percentages mainly. But the kind of data that we actually collect is a lot, and there's a lot of proxy indicators that we collect to know about the family and the socioeconomic conditions. But we actually stop ourselves only at analyzing the data up to a certain limit, because we want to implement a program or or communicate it to the government officials. And for them, we know that, and even for parents or for a headmaster or for someone who's interested in improving education quality, we have understood over years that there are only certain things. Very simple statistics helps. Going to very heavy duty or very complicated tables, graphs, or analysis doesn't always help. So yes, you're right, Samyak, that and Arushi, both of you, that yes, sometimes it's not necessary to get very complicated, very heavy duty, and very data heavy communication, dissemination, or talk around it. Rather than, I think, create data that is easy to understand and easy to pick up and retain for people, rather than making it with us. So yeah, so great. Priyank, thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think just by listening to what you were saying, I think if we go back to the basics of how data analysts, what the role of data analysts are, we could look at the ability to understand the context, how we frame the question. Are we really identifying the root cause, and the ability to break down the data or information that is available. So, as you said, that there is a lot of data available, but then what you present is actually a lot simpler. But then there is a lot of work that goes through to actually filter out what is necessary, organize it in a way that starts making sense. So I think that's something like 4 or 5 essential skills that every data analysis process has, is to understand the context, trying to break it down into simpler language, implement data design where you organize information, categorize it, and then put it into strategy. So I think it just links up both the things together. So.
Right. So again, coming back to advocacy, one of the points that I've been wanted to talk about. So would it be safe to say, would it be correct to say that if we are planning on influencing policy, advocating for a certain cause, while data is important for us, but we shouldn't completely get it should not overshadow or completely get involved. I mean, in the sense, we should not be so strict about having a lot of data, and rather look at what needs to be done and how it needs to be done. Would that be all right? Would you agree with that?
Just barging in here, I think I would, because I've always felt like too much data is always complex to understand. Like, obviously, if I have developed that data, I have fetched it from somewhere, I am very clear on it. But my clarity is not important here. It's the stakeholder that I'm going to has to understand that. So I think too much data always is also an issue. In my opinion, if I am going with, let's say, this weakness is there and we need to address it, I just need to have sufficient data to support that. Okay, this weakness is there and I am coming from a point because I have XYZ number on it. So I think that much data, if I have that backed up data with me, I think that's more than enough to give a perception to the person in front of me.
Okay. And Priyank or Arushi?
Sorry, Arushi, if you were about to. I think IC is also one of the great components of like what we speak of information, education, and communication. When we try to communicate the objectives to the end users, is a very useful tool. how data helps is it helps in targeting the users and, let's say, using the right strategy uh, according to, let's say, the need of a particular ULB. So when we work with, let's say, when I'm working with 20, 25 ULBs at the moment, each city has its own context, own challenges, but then we have a common objective of delivering the objectives to government objectives or policy objectives to the end user. So data does become an important tool to deliver the objectives. Yes, I agree with Samyak. It's not really something that should be centric to every decision that we take, but it's a very important tool in the entire process. And I think if we keep it limited to that I think it's a very useful information. It also helps in validating, also creates feedback loops or something. So it gives you opportunities to reiterate the process that you are trying to implement. So yeah, just a few things.
Yeah, and I think the one thing I strongly agree with what both Priyank and Samyak have said. And I think at the end of the day, we have to think about, like, if I'm collaborating with, say, a state department, what is the reason am I collaborating with them for? If I'm collaborating with them to so that we partner and improve education systems, I think at some level they would also be aware of the challenges that they know. So what is the new thing that we're telling them? I think that's more interesting for anybody to know, like, okay, what is the aha moment? Like, for example, even for the ASER survey, I'm sure for me, the aha moment was the way you've captured the learning outcomes, right? It's not in the way anybody gets it, like, that's not how we've all taken school exams. None of our exams look like that, right? So it's a very different way of capturing somebody's learning outcomes, and often topics that are so abstract, like learning outcomes, empowerment, um, the knowledge about like health outcomes, all these can be tend to be abstract. So if you're able to frame them in an interesting way, I think that really makes a difference. And at the same time, by not focusing on data, I think what we also highlight is that we should also be a little collaborative with the party that's in front of us. If they feel like they're just being cornered, nobody's going to help you out, and nobody wants to be treated in that way. So I think, like, it really is about getting people. I think we talked about this at some point. I can't remember who said it, but having that common ground, right, like with everybody, is far more helpful than showing them 50 data tables. They'll just be like, yeah, we know this, right? Why are you showing us something that we already know? Tell us something new, and how can we work on this together? What is your solution? So I think that is more important anytime when you're communicating evidence. And again, highlighting really, like, what is the new thing that we have come up with is far, far more helpful than reiterating the same thing, which a lot of people know.
Exactly. No, I completely agree. And I think it can put off more than actually motivate people to do something about it. I think Priyank said about having the common ground of, create that common understanding. And what has worked for us has been exactly the same, that taking some data, but very purposefully driven, that would be, what we want to achieve out of it, and working with the direct stakeholders or the people who are working, like district officials. It really helps a lot. I get asked a lot, and Pratham being such a large organization, oh, are you influencing policy at the national level? And everything has to go to the national level. But really, if anything has to improve, the health or education, sanitation, livelihoods, it does come down to the person at the district or the block level. And if that person is convinced, I think it makes a lot of difference. One of the things that we, when we have new researchers joining us, is this, we talk about very freely, is that just because they can't articulate it as well as, we do, parents still know what's best for their child and where they stand. Because when you go to test a child in his or her household, you can see how perplexed the parents are, and they notice. So these are really nice. Are there any, I know, Arushi, you gave some very fine examples, related to your work. I'll also like you to think about how evaluation because that's something that you do, monitoring and evaluation. How does that feed into advocacy, if you have any thoughts on this? And for Samyak and Priyank, I'd like to ask that if you have any examples of, I'm sorry, Priyank, you have given some examples. Samyak, if there is, like, when you're doing policy communication, how has it led to, I'm not saying it's directly causing it, but how has it led to some more, you could say, visibility, more interest? How has that been for you? So yeah, Arushi, would like to go first?
Yeah, clear example I think that something I'm also very close to is when we were presenting one of our interventions, which was kind of like a behaviorally informed intervention to support pregnant women with anemia, and the intervention in itself was had been tested, but we were looking to scale it up, and for that we did a completely different activity, assuming that the intervention stays effective. What we did instead was try and understand the challenges, or try to map like the journey the intervention would have when it would go through the system. So that is starting from the national government official, the Ministry of Health, all the way to the end user beneficiary. And that's what we actually talked about more in our advocacy efforts, is that how this intervention has been modified for the actual context, right? So we did a lot of, I think, observation based studies were also included. We had community researchers who would observe how ashas and ANMs, I believe, were using those interventions, so that we can get an understanding of their lived experiences. Where we were testing these out, I think this was in Jharkhand, and one thing that we realized about Jharkhand is that the distances are quite vast. Oftentimes asha workers were commuting over cycles, and so whatever intervention we're designing has to take in, it can't be bulky. And so, and second was that there's so much that they're telling a pregnant woman, it can be a lot. You'll forget, anybody can forget things. So one again change we made as we included instructions at the back of the intervention, so that when the asha worker is holding it, the back is to her, so she can see instructions really clearly. And then of course trying to understand who is making the decision at what level, and oftentimes it's true, it is the block level officials, it is the ANM asha supervisors who are so incredibly involved. We also realize how, sometimes they get pulled into meetings and all of that. So in our advocacy efforts, we actually highlighted how we've modified the intervention to suit the context after, testing it in those conditions. So that's where, for me, like, it's a different type of an evaluation. It's not the RCT that was being promoted, but what we did to make the intervention relevant.
Great, thank you so much. Samyak, would you like to add your
Yeah,
comments?
so coming up with an example that you were mentioning, if I could give one. So when I was with CPR, the Center for Policy Research, there was a particular study being done on urban water and sanitation, particularly in Odisha, one of the districts. And that's where, like, I would say we assisted with policy comms to amplify that research more. So obviously the local team there were doing their research, and they came up with the recommendations and everything that they had to. But our major point was, we have a research project in hand, but that needs to be communicated to the stakeholders, that they who can do more about it and work more towards it, and for the external public in general to understand that there's this particular issue, and this is the way we can solve it, and everyone can contribute their points. So that was one example that I can think of right now, where we could assist with the policy comms to amplify more about that research.
Oh, lovely. Very nice. I'm glad I asked that question. Okay, Priyank, how about you? And after that, we'll get into questions and answers. So we have some few questions for all of
Yeah,
us.
I mean, mine was a little simpler. I mean, the more outreach that we did, it resulted in more response of, let's say, the service connection that we were supposed to get. But at the same time, we sort of, our role from being an outreach specialist also became a role of a mediator, where we had to navigate between departments and make sure that the work is actually happening. So that was one of the clear impacts that we could see. it was in the more connections that we could generate. Yeah, just want to keep it simple for the time being.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So yeah, we'll get into the questions that we have. And I think Arushi, this question, maybe you can take a go at it first. A participant has asked, having lack of reliable secondary data, is India's problem or first world countries are facing similar issues? That's the one part of the question. And how can we improve the quality of secondary data? Your views and your experience.
Hard for me to assess other countries, but I can talk more about India. And again, I think really depends sector to sector where data is available, where data is not available. Across countries, also, I think I can say that. I think so. Look, in the long-term perspective, secondary data improvement, I'm not going to get into, but like for short term, for something that you're working on immediately, I think it's really important to diversify your own sources of what you are reviewing in secondary data. Like I said, you don't want to fall into a trap of just looking at data that is blindly, confirming that what you've selected is correct. I think Nandita, you said something that really struck me is that when you were doing the survey, Pratham survey, you saw that parents always knew. Like parents can assess, like parents have a sense. And I think really looking at different types of secondary data is really helpful to strengthen your whatever research that you're doing, because good quality evidence can come from a lot of places. And sometimes it's just really a question of pushing your own self and pushing your own critical thinking to identify those sources. Right? So look at a government statistic, look at government studies, but look at other, similar studies maybe done by maybe a foundation, maybe by a private sector, maybe by an NGO, maybe small sample, but I think you will can still walk away with like some nuance, some insight that may have not been included in something that's more official or public. So I think that's what I would say.
Yeah, I agree. Would Samyak or Priyank have any, or are we good with this response? Yeah, agree. Yeah, and I just like to add here is that yes, developed countries, developed economies also struggle with good data. If you have seen some of the series on Netflix and all, where AI or through people, through surveys itself, women, particularly women of color, they've been stereotyped. A lot of benefits do not reach people because there is such strict norms to fit into those that, and if you're not fitting into it, then you don't get the benefits. So that can also sometimes be a huge problem, having like how I think Samyak also put that you don't, I mean, she didn't exactly say that you don't need data or but getting too data dependent on data is also not a very good thing. I mean, letting it decide everything is not the right way of, especially changing social, conditions and helping marginalized people. So that, and um, okay, we have one more question, which is slightly um, uh, what are the policy tools, technical analysis tool do you think helps us in preparing for policy framework? And I'm glad if any of you think that this is not exactly the right forum to answer this question, we can perhaps take these questions. Alaksha, I would request you to take the details of the person and we can perhaps answer in some form or the other. Questions are of course welcome. So any idea on one of anything, any policy tools as such that you have used uh, in preparing policy framework?
I can give, I don't know if it's specifically a framework, but something that I have found helpful for behavioral challenges is it's called the MAO framework, Motivation, Ability, and Opportunity framework, that I find quite useful to break down problems, which is when you are expecting an end user to take certain type of step, that is sending their child to school or making sure they're vaccinated. What would be their motivation? What are the abilities needed? What are the opportunities needed for them to carry out their behavior? I find that very helpful to map out like an initial sort of version of a system that would support or dissuade that behavior from happening.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's, I mean, yeah, I would agree. I mean, yeah, I really don't have any as such policy tools, but if by technical tools, if any statistical tools, then yeah, there are statistical tools that can help us in preparing a policy framework. But um, a policy framework, I think, needs to, I think for any of these policy frameworks to start, I think the first thing very important is to have your purpose very, very well defined. And what I see in most is that people have the tools, people know what, there's a lot of literature review done, but the purpose keeps changing. And like what you said, confirmation bias, it changes because when you don't find what you're looking for, there is a tendency to go and change the questionnaire again and again. And while I have no problem with that, but then one must remember that as you change the question, your questionnaire, your approach, everything will change. So afterwards, coming back to it and thinking that, oh, it still did not answer my question, or my did not serve my purpose, that is a frustration sometimes we have with data collection. So that needs to be looked at very carefully. I think I digressed a bit here, but there's another question. The kind of data which is available in public domain can only help scratch the surface. However, problems in our country are way deeper. How can policymakers first identify the real problems and work towards them with the kind of data available? Priyank, I think this question, I'd like you to put it to you.
It depends how effectively are we was framing the problem, and a lot depends on what we were discussing about systems thinking, systems mapping. How effectively are we mapping the ecosystem of what surrounds the problem? I think a lot of the problems are answered there itself. Sometimes what seems like a really heavy problem requires a very basic solution, which is lying right in front of us, but then we don't really have a way to, you know, draw the pathway of, or maybe understanding if that is the most effective solution or not. So yeah, I think that's something that can be thought about to create a map that is more, let's say, it's easy to understand, visually representing, and at the same time delivers information without using a lot of jargon. Then it turns out, translates the heavy problem into something that is more simple. So yeah, uh, I think that's where it on depends on.
Right. Thank you. Any additional inputs from Samyak or Arushi? Okay. I just want to add here is that we have to remember that the perfect data will never exist, and we have to work around it. So this should not be an excuse for us or anyone. Real problems you really want to know, get on the ground, go there. Even an hour of spending, with whoever you're working with, either with sanitation, environment, even an hour's engagement on ground is worth a lot of literature reviews and discussions and meetings and forums and things like that. I think that really makes you understand what the real problem is. And the second, I would say, and this will also come to people who somebody has asked about secondary data, is that pilot at what I think Arushi also mentioned, pilot at a small scale. It's not very expensive. It's not cumbersome, but it gives you a flavor. It tells you, that it gives you good estimation of what to do and what to expect. So let's not, of course, being a large country, we get into this, that we will do it in a very large scale. No. And yes, I come from an organization which does everything at scale, but it has taken us 3 decades. So, scale is very good, but it's okay. It's okay to be localized, okay to be start small and then slowly build it block by block. In fact, you will make less mistakes and have a more robust system. Coming to the last two questions, and we are of course also, we have constraints of time. This one is fairly easy. Does the current digital public infrastructure lack responsible data practices? How can the Samaj and Bazaar address them? Samyak, would you like to answer that?
So, yeah, when it comes to DPI in particular, I would say there are a lot of issues coming up with the data that they have, majorly the cybersecurity issues, and they are increasing day by day. There's one every other day, particularly when it comes to digital payments and stuff. People are very scared to use these platforms because of cyber threats and everything. But my opinion is that to resolve these issues, we need to have proper regulations which are quite limited when it comes to DPI for now, and proper regulations which will help aid these, because I believe that DPI is the future, of course, and everything is now revolving around it. So obviously, just proper regulations and proper guidelines on how to use these, and to have a proper framework on how to avoid these is essential. Plus, as I also mentioned earlier, I have read a lot recently on these, and technologies like AI are helping curb cyber threats a lot. And there are a lot of research evolving around it, because AI has been the most important tool for a lot of organization to curb these issues, because it can help trigger if there's been a cyber threat or anything for that matter. So yeah, I think these are some evolving issues when it comes to DPI in terms of data, but because DPI is also fairly new for the society, these regulations will surely come up to regulate the space.
Can I just comment for one thing? I want to add one point. I think one more thing, and linking back to what Priyank said, that are we asking the right question? I think growth of DPI in India and the challenges around it and how the system is responding to it, I think it's a good example of not asking the right question. I think rather than being like, oh, how do we make it safer or whatever, I think a lot of times the missing is like what are the challenges people facing right now, and is the DPI even geared towards making people feel that they can engage with any sort of public platform, right? Like if I think the messaging also around it is so focused that if you make a mistake, you're going to lose money. I feel like rather than that, the focus of a communication is also not even like we can save you if you make a mistake, reach out to this, right? I think this is such a good example of not asking the right question and then running a full communication campaign which is not focused on addressing the right pain points. I think this is such a good example of if you have asked the right question, you would have really solved a lot of the problem upfront about DPI as well.
Thank you. This was spot on. We have a last question that we have, which say that goes like this. We have discussed about the existence of good quality or enough data for formulating and designing policies or interventions. I'd like to understand how we can make M&E a mandatory process after implementation of any intervention or scheme. Do you think the data collected during the M&E process can bridge the existing data gaps that can be used more generically apart from using it to improve the particular program? Arushi would like to take that. And Priyank, if you feel like adding, most welcome.
I feel like adding that M&E is compulsory. We set up an entire office. No, M&E is very much a part of, I think, more than anything, I think let's taking a step back. I think M&E is very much compulsory in all government interventions. The intent of that M&E is something different. It's not necessarily looking at effectiveness. I think it's looking at is the process followed, right? Because the government is using taxpayers' money, so is the process being followed to the T? I think that is where a lot of the M&E data gets collected for. Second is, I think, again, I don't think M&E systems is necessarily the problem, but again, it's like, how is your governance system structured to take in regular feedback of schemes? That doesn't happen, right? Like if the person in charge of running an intervention or delivering a service moves very often, that institutional knowledge has to restart every single time. We also don't collect disaggregated data. So how do you make decisions? Secondly, I think the decision making for sectors varies. In health, a lot of times literally block officers have no decision-making authority, whereas the decision-making authority rides a little further away. How do you bridge that physical distance between people? So I don't think like M&E, I think again, not having robust M&E systems is a challenge. I think our M&E systems are not geared towards focusing on improvement. I think they're also very geared towards fulfilling that, process is done. It's very process evaluation rather than, is the other services reaching. But yeah, Priyank, Samyak also would like to hear from you.
Yeah, well, I could not agree more to what you have already said. Yeah, governance structure is something that really plays an important part. I mean, the MD should be in support of if the officers or let's say the departments are working in the right way or not. I think that should be one of the clear criteria. But it is very dependent on I was also trying to say that my KPI was towards IEC. The one of the impacts is the connections that we have done. But I think it should not be limited to that. I think there's a lot more that happened, and the MD framework could maybe be documenting that as well. So yeah, I think if it focuses a bit towards the governance structure and towards the allocation of responsibilities and how effectively is that being delivered and how much of that is from requiring a lot of interference being done on an auto-run board is something that can be looked upon. Yeah, Samyak.
No, I think Arushi and Priyank have almost covered it. I just wanted to say here that, in my opinion, M&E is the most significant step when it comes to policy implementation. Like, you can implement a policy, a new scheme can start, but if you do not know if it's working out or not, or identify the gaps that are there through the M&E process, I don't think that policy would ever be effective enough. So, in my opinion, that is the most important stage when it comes to policy implementation.
Totally agree on that completely. And I think while yes, many yes, the evaluation, whether it just focuses on process or effectiveness, which it ideally should, but it does improve the system, like it improves the data collection. But what data has already been collected? So the caveat here is that, and there always will be a trade-off like this, that while you keep improving systems, but then you also remember that you comparing systems becomes difficult, because every time if you're changing the questions depending on what feedback you're getting from your monitoring and evaluation, uh, as you keep changing it, some things remain the same but many other things will change. So then that may uh, cause at least slight delay or difficulty in uh, tracking it and spotting trends. That's a, and in causes that we work in, trends are very important, because this is we can't really, not for all of these things we can have longitudinal data all the time, but even having like month wise, like end line, midline, even over a year, I mean, depending upon the cause, like if it's infant mortality, there's a completely different timeline. So yeah, I mean, M&E is important, very very important, but whether it can change, but how effective will it make it is remains to be seen. And it takes a number of iterations before you can really come up to and say that yes, now we are here and we can continue with this, and this is what we have to see whether there has been a proper impact as it was supposed to happen. Okay, thank you so much for your answers and for all that you've spoken so far. I hand over to Alaksha. Thank you so much for helping me, Alaksha, navigate through these questions.
Thank you, Nandita. Wow, such an insightful session this has been. Through the session, we understood how important reliable, disaggregated data for effective policy making is, and addressing those gaps, particularly in India. And also, we noted that sector to sector, the data availability does vary a lot. We do need to shift our focus from the outcome to the from the output to the outcomes, like ASER did. And this is especially very important in India, where we keep on focusing on the outputs rather than the outcomes. Also, having a zoomed out lens approach could be like really could play a very valuable role to identify the interdependencies. And investing in primary data and of course balancing human input with algorithm would ensure and well-designed culturally relevant solutions. On behalf of everyone here, I want to extend a heartfelt gratitude to our esteemed panelists. Your invaluable insight into how data analysis shapes policy decisions have given us a lot to reflect on. Lastly, thank you everyone who has joined us today, and I hope you all have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you
so
so
much.
much, everyone. Thank you.